Exploring the Titanic, Chapter 5, Part 2. Suddenly, as we rose up the port side of the ship, the sub shuddered and made a clanging noise. A waterfall of rust covered our portholes. "We've hit something," I exclaimed. "What is it?" "I don't know," our pilot replied. "I'm backing off." Unseen overhangs are the nightmare of the deep sub pilot. Carefully, the pilot backed away from the hull and brought us slowly upward. Then, directly in front of our forward porthole, a big lifeboat, David, slid by. We had hit one of the metal arms that held the lifeboats as they were lowered. This David was one of two that had held the boat number 8. The boat Mrs. Strauss had refused to enter that night. She was the wife of the owner of Macy's department store in New York. When she had been offered a chance to save herself in one of the lifeboats, she had turned to her husband and said, "We have been living together for many years. Where you go, I go." Calmly, the two of them had sat down on a pile of deck chairs to wait for the end. Now, as we peered out of our portholes, it seemed as if the boat deck were crowded with passengers. I could almost hear the cry, "Women and children first!" We knew from the previous year's pictures that the stern had broken off the ship, so we continued back to search for the severed end of the intact bow section. Just beyond the gaping hole where the second funnel had been, the deck began to plunge down at a dangerous angle. The graceful lines of the ship disappeared in a twisted mess of torn steel plating, upturned portholes, and jumbled wreckage. We saw enough to know that the decks of the ships had collapsed in on one another like a giant accordion. With an unexpectedly strong current pushing us towards this twisted wreckage, we veered away and headed for the surface. The next day, we landed on the deck next to the very edge of the grand staircase, which had once been covered by an elegant glass dome. This dome hadn't survived the plunge, but the staircase shaft had, and to me it still represented the fabulous luxury of the ship. Alvin now rested quietly on the top deck of the RMS Titanic, directly above the place where 3 elevators had carried first-class passengers who did not wish to use the splendid grand staircase. We, however, would take the stairs with JJ the robot, our R2-D2 of the deep. This would be the first deep-water test for our remote-controlled swimming eyeball, and we were very nervous about it. No one knew whether JJ's motors could stand up to the enormous ocean pressure of more than 6,000 pounds per square inch. Using a control box with a joystick that operated like a video game, the operator cautiously steered JJ out of his garage attached to the front of Alvin. Slowly, JJ went inching down into the yawning blackness of the grand staircase. More and more cable was let out as he dropped deeper and deeper. We could see what JJ was seeing on our video in the sub, but at first JJ could see nothing. Then, as he dropped deeper, a room appeared off the port side foyer of A deck. JJ swung around, and our co-pilot saw something in the distance. "Look at that," he said softly. "Look at that chandelier." Now I could see it too. "No, it can't be a chandelier," I said. "It couldn't possibly have survived." I couldn't believe my eyes. The ship had fallen 2.5 miles, hitting the bottom with the force of a train running into a mountain, and here was an almost perfectly preserved light fixture. JJ left the stairwell and started to enter the room, managing to get within a foot of the fixture. To our astonishment, we saw a feathery piece of coral sprouting from it. We could even see the sockets where the light bulbs had been fitted. "This is fantastic," I exulted. "Bob, we're running out of time. We have to return to the surface." Our pilot's words cut like a knife through my excitement. Here we were, deep inside the Titanic, actually going down the grand staircase, but we had used up all the time that we had to stay safely on the bottom. I knew our pilot was just following orders, but I still wanted to shout and protest. Our little robot soldier emerged from the black hole and shone his lights towards us, bathing the interior of the sub in an unearthly glow. For a moment, it felt as if an alien spaceship were hovering nearby, but that feeling quickly gave way to one of victory, thanks to our little friend. JJ had been a complete success. On our next day's dive, we crossed over what had once been Captain Smith's cabin. Its outer wall now lay collapsed on the deck, as though a giant had brought his fist down on it. We passed within inches of one of the cabin's windows. Was this, I wondered, a window that Captain Smith had cranked open to let a little fresh air into his cabin before going to bed? Suddenly, a large piece of broken railing loomed out of the darkness. It seemed to be heading right for my viewport. I immediately warned the pilot, who quickly turned Alvin's stern around, rotating us free of the obstacle. Now we began to drop onto the starboard boat deck. As we glided along, I felt as though I were visiting a ghost town, where suddenly one day everyone had closed up shop and left. An empty lifeboat davit stood nearby. Ahead, I could see where the Titanic's lifeboats had rested. It was on this very deck that the crowds of passengers had stood waiting to get into the boats. They had not known until the last moments that there were not enough lifeboats for everyone. It was also from this deck that you could have heard the Titanic's brave band playing cheerful music to boost the crowd's spirits as the slope of the deck grew steeper and steeper. Jason Jr. now went for a stroll along the boat deck. As he made his way along, he looked into the windows of several first-class cabins as well as into some passageways, including one that still bore the words first-class entrance. As JJ passed by the gymnasium windows, I could see bits and pieces of equipment amid the rubble, including some metal grillwork that had been part of the electric camel, an old-fashioned exercise machine. We could also see various wheel shapes and a control lever. Much of the gym's ceiling was covered with rust. This was where the gym instructor, dressed in white flannel trousers, had urged passengers to try the gym machines. And on the last night, passengers gathered here for warmth as the lifeboats were being lowered. I could see JJ far off down the deck, turning this way and that to get a better view inside doorways and various windows. It was almost as though our little robot had a mind of its own. But now we had to bring him home. We had been on the Titanic for hours. Once again, it was time to head back to the surface. The morning of July 18th was lovely and warm, but I felt edgy about today's mission. We had decided to visit the Titanic's debris field. Along the 1,970 feet that separated the broken off bow and stern pieces of the wreck, there was a large scattering of all kinds of objects from the ship. Everything from lumps of coal to wrought iron deck benches had fallen to the bottom as she broke in two and sank. But I was anxious about what we might find down there among the rubble. I had often been asked about the possibility of finding human bodies. It was a chilling thought. We had not seen any signs of human remains so far, but I knew that if we were to find any, it would most likely be during this dive. As the first fragments of wreckage began to appear on the bottom, I felt like we were entering a bombed-out museum. Thousands upon thousands of objects littered the rolling fields of the ocean bottom, many of them perfectly preserved. The guts of the Titanic lay spilled out across the ocean floor. Cups and saucers, silver serving trays, pots and pans, wine bottles, booze chamber pots, space heaters, bathtubs, suitcases, and more. Then, without warning, I found myself looking into the ghostly eyes of a small, white, smiling face. For a split second, I thought it was a skull, and it really scared me. But then I realized I was looking at a doll's head, its hair and clothes gone. My shock turned to sadness as I began to wonder who had owned this toy. Had the girl survived on one of the lifeboats, or had she clutched the doll tightly as she sank into the icy waters? We moved on through this amazing scenery. There were so many things scattered about that it became difficult to keep track of them. We came across one of the ship's boilers, and there on top of it sat an upright, rusty metal cup like the ones that the crew had used. It looked as though it had been placed there by a stoker moments before water had burst into the boiler room. It was astonishing to think that, in fact, this cup had just fluttered down that night to land right on top of the boiler. Then, in the light of Alvin's headlights, we spotted a safe ahead of us. I had heard about the story of a fabulous treasure, including a leather-bound book covered in jewels, being locked in the ship's safes when she sank. Here was the chance of a lifetime, and I wanted to get a good look at it. The safe sat there with its door face up. The handle looked as though it was made of gold, although I knew it had to be brass. Next to it, I could see a small circular gold dial, and above both a nice shiny gold chest. Why not try open it? I watched as Alvin's sample gathering arm locked its metal fingers onto the handle. Its metal wrist began to rotate clockwise. To my surprise, the handle turned easily. Then it stopped. The door just wouldn't budge. It was rusted shut. I felt as if I'd been caught with my hand in the cookie jar. Oh well, I thought, it was probably empty anyway. In fact, when we later looked at the video footage we had taken, we could see that the bottom of the safe had rusted out. Any treasure should have been spread around nearby, but there was none to be seen. Fortunately, my promise to myself not to bring back anything from the Titanic was not put to test. 2 days passed before I went down to the Titanic again. After the rest, I was raring to go at it once more. This time, we were going to explore the torn-off stern section that lay 1,970 feet away from the bow. It had been very badly damaged during the plunge to the bottom. Now it lay almost unrecognizable amidst badly twisted pieces of wreckage. We planned to land Alvin on the bottom directly behind the stern section, and then send JJ in under the overhanging hull. Unless the Titanic's 3 huge propellers had fallen off when she sank, I figured they still ought to be there, along with her enormous 101-ton rudder. We made a soft landing on the bottom and discovered that one of JJ's motors wouldn't work. Our dive looked like a washout. I sat glumly, staring out of my viewport at the muddy bottom. Suddenly, the mud started to move. Our pilot was slowly inching Alvin forward on its single ski right under the dangerous overhang stern area. He was taking the sub itself to search for its huge propellers. Was he crazy? What if a piece of wreckage came crashing down? But our pilot was a professional, so I figured he must know exactly what he was doing. I could see an area ahead covered with rusticles that had fallen from the rim of the stern above. Until now, we had had ocean above us. Crossing this point was like taking a dangerous dare. Once on the other side, there was no sure way of escaping if disaster struck. None of us spoke. The only sound in the sub was our breathing. Slowly, a massive black surface of steel plating seemed to inch down towards us overhead. The hull seemed to be coming at us from all sides. As we looked closely, we could see that, like the bow, the stern section was buried deep in the mud, 45 feet or so. Both the middle and the starboard propellers were under the mud. Only about 16 feet of the massive rudder could be seen rising out of the ooze. "Let's get out of here," I said, ever